Hey everybody, welcome back to Console. In this episode, I got private beta access to the OpenAI API. I saw a post with a bunch of demos of theirs maybe a month ago, something like that. And after I saw how impressive those demos were, I wanted to give the API a shot myself. I requested for beta access then and just barely got it maybe like a week ago. So in this video, we're going to kind of give it a look from a developer's perspective, kind of see what it takes to onboard to the API and see what sort of functionality the API provides, as well as like how well the AI behaves behind the scenes of the API. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So this is the email that I got from the OpenAI team. I just wanted to show it to you guys and brag that I'm getting beta access to something before it's released. So this was the page that I saw a couple months ago that had all the super cool examples that kind of drew me into requesting beta access. As I said before in the intro, I'll be sure to drop a link to this in the description below. Anyway, you can see here there's a bunch of various use cases that they've pulled off with the OpenAI API. What was most interesting about the API for me was like how flexible it was. Like the same AI could be used for a bunch of various different tasks. I was kind of expecting that the API kind of be broken up based on like use case, which is like kind of typical for AI, right? It's usually trained for one very specific thing. But in this case, it could do a bunch of different things all using the same API, which was really cool. So the page, if you click the link in the description below, the page has a bunch of videos outlining a bunch of use cases and apps that people have built using the API. So I definitely recommend checking those out. I'm not going to go through those in this video, right? Because I'm more focused on like, you know, what does the API actually behave like? But again, these are what drew me into like asking for private beta access. So I'd recommend checking all these videos out. So this one in particular is the one that drew me in. When I saw this, I was like, okay, I definitely have to request beta access. It's actually a natural language shell interpreter, effectively. So what's really cool about this is you can type in language, like in the English language, commands you want to run, and the AI, the OpenAI API, will like interpret that natural language and provide you a command to run. Which I was like, when I saw that, I was like totally blown away. I was like, okay, I have to check this thing out. So yeah, definitely check that example out. I think you can even play around with that example in more detail without having private beta access. Here's me tweeting them to let them know how cool this project is. Here's another one. I know I said I wasn't going to go through these videos, but some of the more interesting ones I figured were worth a look at. This one's really cool too. It seems to be like an Excel plugin. I didn't actually mess around with it, but it will like AI autocomplete on your Excel spreadsheets effectively. So in this example they give in the video, it's like it's able to detect that you're talking about tech companies and suggest headers, and then like auto-populate the headers with financial data related to the tech companies. I was like, this is really cool. This is the one we're actually going to be looking at the most. Is they have a summarizer kind of a thing where you can give it some text and say, hey, summarize this as if I was a second grader, right? So I thought that one was kind of the most fascinating, and so I spent the most time working on that one. This one's a translator, but in the same video they also show you the explain like I'm 5 summarizer, if you will. I think this blog post might have been the one that I saw that originally like led me to request access. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but one thing they point out is like they kind of want to make AI more universal, I guess, and in that sense, I do think they've kind of succeeded a little bit in their goal. Like often it's the case that these big tech companies have the best AI because they've got so many machine learning engineers that they can throw at a problem, right? Or data scientists, or AI researchers. And kind of what they've done is they've given that same power out to the public, such that like small businesses can harness the same powers that a lot of these big tech companies already have. So I do think they've done a good thing in that so far, in deciding to give out this API publicly. So in the email, they gave out like a couple of blog posts for like their, I don't know, pseudo influencers, if you will. And I'm going through one of these right now. I'll actually link to it in the description as well. But he's pointing out a bunch of use cases after he tried out the Summarizer API, which was another one that I was kind of interested in. He points out all these different use cases, and so you can see here I'm like listing out business ideas, going like, is this a potential business? Could you provide a service that does summarization of news articles on social media, let's say? Like, could you maybe do a Chrome extension that does that, or something like that, something along those lines, right? So he's pointing out a bunch of these really interesting use cases. Later we'll find out that the AI isn't quite production ready, in my opinion, right? It gives you too many bad results, so that if you put this in front of a customer, like I would imagine they're going to uninstall your application really quickly because it's not Loctite, right? Software engineering's gotten to the point where users expect the thing to work flawlessly all the time, and if there's ever any bugs in it, they're going to uninstall the thing like really quickly. So I could see the same thing happening here, and I'll show you some results of some tests that I ran on the AI. But for now, it's obviously an interesting thing to think about into the future. But as we keep seeing over and over again, I don't think AI is quite there yet. Okay, enough philosophizing. This is what the dashboard looks like after you've signed in effectively to the private API, and those are my API keys, so I'm going to be blurring those out. They give you a bunch of snippets of code. You can see here there's like a curl command you can run to hit their API endpoint with a little test, right? It'll complete this is a test text prompt and return you back a response. And then below this, they also have some Python code. I'm not going to show you that, but they also have some Python code. But we'll actually do a little bit of writing of Python while we're testing it out. Because what I do is they have a little playground, which you just like dump the prompt text in and it spits out the responses. And I wanted to see if like maybe the Python client was a little bit more performant, or maybe it gave some better responses or something like that. So we do write a little bit of Python code, and you'll see the snippets for that as well. And you can see here that the curl command works, right? I get a response back. It says the completion is environment if all passes, right? Because I said max tokens of 5, so it only gave me a small response back. But it did in fact work using my API key right out of the box. And you can see here that I'm running it again, right, with higher max tokens. I kind of also wanted to see if the API was like deterministic as well, right? One thing you can see here is like the latency increases dramatically the higher number of tokens you provide to the API. So right here, I'm just quickly installing the Python library. Eventually, we start writing some Python code, but more importantly, the API. Like once you install the library, you actually have a command line, OpenAI command line. So I wanted to check that out, which is why I actually initially installed the library, and it works, almost identical to the curl command. So right here, they've got a bunch of videos on the dashboard, and they basically just walk you through the playground and kind of what sort of parameters you're allowed to tweak when making a request to the API, right? These map exactly to the same sort of request you would send in the Python code as well, right? You can send a response length in between these variables. You can change the temperature and all these other things. So right here, they're just walking you through, like, this is the playground, these are the parameters you're allowed to change, and all these other things. So after watching the videos, I decided to dive right in for myself. They've got a bunch of examples here that they've like pre-populated the data for you for the onboarding, which I thought was quite nice. In this particular case, they've got an unstructured data, right? They've just got some random text in a paragraph, and you can see the API right here is like generating the graph. It's like finishing the table for me, right? So they pre-populated a set of table values, and then I just say go, and it will keep populating those as well. What I am doing is I take that unstructured text and I dump it into the summarizer. Like I said earlier in the video, I was really interested in the summarizer more than anything else, and so I was like, well, let's see if they can summarize their own random garbage paragraph. And indeed, you can see like that's the AI right there is like responding back to my request to summarize this data for a second grader effectively, and you can see it's doing it quite nicely. So I decided to put it to a real test, right? The blog author was talking about one of the potential use cases for this they could see is like summarizing research papers. And I just so happened to have a research paper that I was planning on reviewing for Consul on a quantum computing programming language. And so I thought, okay, let's see what this thing could do. And I naively, decided to dump the entirety of the research paper because I don't know. To me, it seems like a busy professional is not going to take the time to parse a research paper, which is in PDF format, into a specific format for an AI. So I was like, let's just pretend like I'm an idiot and I don't know anything about AI. Let's just dump this all in, right? And it obviously doesn't end up working. For one particular reason is they've got token limits, right? So I think it was like 2,400 was the limit on the number of tokens, which is kind of unfortunate, right? Because most research papers that you end up reading are going to be way more than 2,000 tokens, and so you're not going to be able to get a clear summary of the entirety of the research paper. You can see here that's failing. It doesn't really tell me why it's failing until I do a bunch of hacking on the text, but I end up finding out that there's a token limit here to the number of data you can pass into the AI. Once I figure that out, I give it smaller and smaller text, and we'll skip forward to that. So right here, you can see that I'm taking the abstract rather than the entirety of the research paper. I'm dumping that out and then asking for a summarization of the abstract itself rather than the entirety of the research paper, which is, substantially less useful, right? I can read the abstract myself and get a summarization of that, so it's not really going to save me that much time. But you can see indeed that it does give me a fairly useful summarization of the abstract itself. So after a little bit of failure there, I decide, let's see what happens if I run this through the Python client rather than through the playground. Maybe the playground's less performant, or has a different AI model that takes up less resources, or something to that effect. So I quickly code up using the Python library that we installed previously, kind of the same example here. So what I end up doing this time around is taking the plot of East of Eden and dumping that into the Python library to see if it's able to summarize the plot of East of Eden. Given I've read the book, so I kind of know what I expect it to print out. It ends up giving me the same, token size error, right, where I'm giving it too much text to summarize, which is a bad sign. That gives me the impression that the Python library isn't actually going to do anything different than the playground, and in fact that is the case. So here I give it a much smaller subset of the plot to do summarization on, and the summarization is not good at all. There's some random stuff where they start talking about a boat and a shotgun and all this stuff, and none of that happens in the plot of East of Eden. If you've read East of Eden, there's no shotguns involved here. So it's not a great sign if it's not even able to take, the text of a novel and summarize that. One thing I did notice though is the size of the tokens kind of might dictate how good or how bad the summarization is, right? It's almost like the AI will ramble. If you give it too many tokens, if you allow it to generate too many tokens, it will just kind of start rambling, which is what's happening here. But also at the same time, the reason I bumped the max tokens up so high is because it was summarizing one subset of the plot rather than the entirety of the plot, right? Which is a bit of a problem, right? When I give it the text of an entire book, I don't want the summary of chapter 2. I want the summary of the entire book, right? Which is a seriously difficult problem for an AI to be able to do, right? Which is, part of the problem with, I keep saying, is, AI isn't nearly where we expect it to be, right? I understand why the AI isn't able to do what I want it to do, but, I was kind of hopefully, after I saw these demos, I was thinking, oh, maybe this time's different, right? But it turns out, it was giving me a subset of the plot, and then so I was like, okay, well, maybe if I give it a larger amount of text to generate, maybe it'll give me the rest of the plot, but instead it just started rambling, as you can see here. So I was like, I'm not giving up though, right? After I gave it a bunch of tests, right, took me maybe an hour or two to finally go, okay, this isn't gonna work. I went back to my blog author, the guy who gave me the idea for the research papers, and was like, okay, I read some more of his blogs because they were interesting things, and one of the things he points out is list generation. I think he does DC superheroes or something in a list, and so I was like, okay, I'm willing to give that a shot. One of the things I've always wanted to do is put recommendations in a lot of my software that I sell to people. So I was like, well, maybe this thing can do really good recommendations or something like that. But then, I think some of the cloud providers already provide recommender systems. I haven't tested those out, but since this thing's general and those are more specific, they might actually be better recommenders than this thing. Uh, it would be worth testing those out and like comparing the two or something like that. In this particular case, what I'm doing is just like picking some movies off the top of my head and seeing like, can it generate recommendations from this list of 3 movies. It ends up being pretty good at it, actually, surprisingly. Yeah, after it was unable to do the text thing, I was like, oh, nice. So you can see here it's giving me more Harry Potter movies, which, are in kind of the fantasy genre of movies that I was giving it here. You can see here I'm bumping the text tokens again because I want to see like how many of these. Is it going to start rambling again, right, in terms of recommendations? I wanted to see like what is the sweet spot of recommendations here. And again, you can see this latency problem, right? Like the more tokens you give it, the longer it takes to generate those recommendations, which again makes computational sense. But you can see here it's suggesting like Narnia and a bunch of other, like maybe you could call them kids' fantasy novels, if they will. It's kind of getting confused between novels and movies, which makes sense, right? The things I gave it could be books or movies in this case. It's given me a little bit of both. Yeah, so this particular case, I think where you just give it a list is like actually really useful. It performed very well. Another one I do is musicians later on, and it's able to like recommend more musicians from the ones I give it as well. So I would definitely give it an A+ in this particular case. That's everything for this week's episode of Console. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the little bell. That way you get a push notification every time there's a new episode of Console. This episode was really good. It was really fun to play around with AI. It was really easy to play around with, part of the problem with AI is it's got a high barrier of entry. And in this case, it was just really as simple as like giving some text to their API and getting some text response back. I mentioned that earlier in the video that I think they succeeded very well in making AI easy to use for people who maybe are less technical or are machine learning engineers or something like that. That said, again, we bumped up against the fact that AI isn't quite where we would expect it to be able to run a lot of these things in production. There were a bunch of other like AI APIs that I didn't review, but if there's like a lot of interest in this particular episode, I'll be more than happy to go back and maybe even build a product with some of these APIs. Until then, I will see you next week.